everyone. I hope you're all doing well. I wanted to welcome you to this month's P&G Alumni Network Enrichment Series webinar. I'm your host, Ileana Rojas, and I hope you're all safe and well. Today, we have a wonderful guest. However, before we begin our conversation, I want to tell you a little bit about the Enrichment Series and P&G alumni. Our monthly series, this is our monthly series where our goal is to connect members and provide enriching content where we hope that you'll learn something new and leave you with something inspiring. And we do this by leveraging the expertise that we have within the network. Now, P&G Alumni this is part of a bigger mission that we have here at P&G Alumni. And P&G Alumni is a nonprofit founded by former P&G employees to share ideas, talents, resources with each other, our community, and our philanthropy efforts. We have more than 35,000 members worldwide with 45 chapters. And also the P&G alumni is recognized officially by Procter & Gamble. And we connect through a variety of different means like the webinars, we have podcasts, we have local events and global events, and our nonprofit foundation supports economic empowerment initiatives in communities around the world. Also, every other year, we come together in a global conference. Normally it's in person. Last year, for obvious reasons, we had one virtual one in November with great success. And the next one is planned next year for the fall, hopefully in Washington, D.C. So I invite you to put a hold on your calendar, save the date, and we'll keep you posted towards the end of the year with more information. Now, this is our webinar logistics and our platform. We've recently changed it. From those of you that have been following us, you'll see our screen. This is a webinar format, but you'll still be able to interact through the chat function and the Q&A function. So we definitely invite you to do so. And I'll make sure that I leave all the questions towards the end. Now, if we don't get through all the questions because of time, but I'll make sure that I try to run with as many as possible. Now, before we begin, let me run a couple of polls to see who's visiting us today virtually. So let me launch the first one. Well, thank you, everybody, as always, your information, for sharing your information. So without further ado, Bob, thank you so much for being with us. Let me stop sharing my screen so that you can share yours and we can get started.
Very good. Well, thank you, Ileana. Thank you for putting the time in that you do to host these. So, good morning, I guess afternoon or evening, wherever you are. I know there's people from around the world, so I think that's really cool, and I'm glad that you joined. I'm really going to be sharing my thoughts today on my experience from going from a career of corporate leadership to a small-scale startup. So if that's what you were expecting, you're in the right place. If not, maybe stick along and you'll learn something along the way. I do enjoy the Q&A and the dialogue, so I'm going to try to keep this to about 30 or 40 minutes, and then hopefully we can have some Q&A and some conversation at the end. I did put my email address on the last slide, so if you don't get your question answered, feel free to reach out to me afterwards. And I do love to hear from all old colleagues and former P&Gers, so please reach out. And yeah, I'll start with a little bit of my background just to kind of set the stage for my decision to leave corporate America and do the startup. Obviously, I started at P&G, so I spent 20 years from 1990 to 2011 at P&G. And I'd say my career track was a little bit unique. I spent most of my career in marketing. I launched Thermacare, spent some time in Geneva with oral care NBD, came back as part of the launch of White Strips, and we launched Crest Night Effects, went over to Pampers and did the global launch of Can Do. And then I joined the Publix, or rather the chain grocery shopper marketing team when that was kind of in its infancy, and then moved up to Connecticut, where I am now, to lead the Duracell brand from a marketing perspective. So if you see a pattern there, it's really that I enjoyed launching new brands, enjoyed being part of something different and new, and I never shied away from kind of trying something new. Like when the shopper marketing organization was brand new, I raised my hand and said, that sounds fun. I think I'll do that. So I've always really kind of been interested in learning new things and doing something new. So when I left P&G, I didn't go to the typical CPG company. After you leave P&G, I went into something that I was super passionate about, and that was travel. And I led the Sheraton and Westin brands at Starwood Hotels. They're here in Connecticut as well, and I absolutely had a blast. There's probably still my favorite experience of all of my corporate roles that I've done. I was there for 6 years. Absolutely loved the travel industry and had a great time. Left when everything moved down to Marriott bought Starwood, and I know people might have various opinions about that, but what they did to the programs there. But I left when Marriott acquired us and went to another passion of mine, which is the auto industry. So I grew up in Detroit, had always been around cars and absolutely loved that industry. So this was the last role that I did before joining the startup that I'm at now. I was the global, or the America's CMO for Volvo. There were a lot of things about the brand that just connected with me personally. I drove a Volvo when I joined, which is always helpful, and we relaunched the brand. And if you've seen any Volvos on the road lately, I think it's a new and different brand than it was, probably back when most of us were growing up. So I spent 3 years there, and then left and joined the company I'm at now, Hydrosome Labs. And I'll talk a little bit about the company in a few slides, just to give you a little bit more perspective on, what we do and set the stage for my observations on joining a startup. But suffice to say, I've been having an absolute blast. So this has been a fun experience for me. So in terms of, what I want to talk about, it's really my perspective of joining a startup and moving from a big company into something small. I call it my Great Resignation story because I left Volvo in the early part of 2020. So you could say I was an early adopter to the Great Resignation. I left that corporate job and, was in a position to basically do, whatever I wanted, whatever I was passionate about. And I had always wanted to join a startup. So that's the path I started to pursue. I think this hopefully fits in nicely. I don't think this was planned, but if you've been paying attention to the Enrichment Series talks, you probably saw Dan Rajak and Mike Prager talk about joining a mid-sized company or joining private equity. So if you're considering a career move, this is just kind of one other option that I think you can consider, and hopefully I can give you a little bit of advice and things to think about. So in terms of, the context that my advice is given in, I've been at the startup for a little over a year. I've been involved with them for about 2, but I've formally been an employee for a little over a year. And, I was initially asked, about a year ago to do this talk. Ida reached out to me, and I think at the time, I don't even think I had posted on my LinkedIn that I was at a new company yet. So I think that the ask was, can you come on and talk about some of your experiences in marketing at a big company? And I said, well, I'm not really at a big company anymore, and I'm a bit removed from that now and thinking about other things, but I'd be happy to talk about my experience at a startup. And how startups go. I said, it could be a massive failure story, or it could be, a glorious, growth story. I have no idea what I'm going to talk about, but I'm sure I'll have something to talk about in a year. So I said, yeah, let's go ahead and do it. And I think that's kind of a lesson in itself in terms of, what personality type I guess you need to have if you're going to join a startup, because you're stepping into the unknown, and you have to be willing to step into the unknown and really not know what you're getting into. So in terms of my startup, we are a bit of a unique startup. Every startup's different, industry, point of time that you are in the startup. I'll give you a little bit of background on the startup so that you can take my advice in context. And I'll just share a little bit of my personal philosophy on what's worked for me and what I've found to be transferable from P&G. So I'll give you the answers right up front, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about these. But these are really my 6 observations from what I've learned as I've dove into this whole world of venture capital and startup and small companies. You need to build credibility up front before you even get the invitation to join. Really follow your passions. Well, I'll talk a lot about that, but you're going to be doing this, potentially weekends and late at night, and talking to investors that need to feel your passion. So you have to be passionate about the category or the company you're joining. You're going to be the culture, you and your founders, depending on how big the company is, but making sure that there's cultural fit is key, and thinking about the culture you want to create is key. Strategy being the foundation. It is always key to have a strategy up front, and that is one of the probably most important things that I took from the big company experience to joining a startup. Embracing uncertainty, you got a taste of that and what I was talking about on this presentation, and then the race to revenue. So I'll talk a little bit more in detail and share some stories around each one of these as we go. But before we do that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Hydrosome, just so that I can put the stories and everything else in context, and where we are. So I could probably talk for an hour about this. I'm going to try to keep this really short, but I do think it's important to just know the type of startup that I joined, and there are some things that are a little bit, I'd say, different than your typical startup. So we're a water company. We have a technology that improves the functionality of water as a delivery vehicle for active ingredients or solutes. We were started formally in March of 2020. I started not long after that advising the company. We have a patented technology that I won't get into all the details of the chemistry and all that, but it is fascinating how much science has advanced in the last 10 years. If you're interested, I encourage everybody just to Google ortho and para water after this call. You'll be really amazed to learn that there's different types of water molecules out there, that science community is pretty convinced around now, and it's just one example of how much chemistry and science has evolved since we probably were all in college or high school chemistry. But we are tapping into some of those recent learnings with our technology, and without adding anything to water, we're able to improve the ability of the water to deliver solutes and active ingredients. We're well financed, so what may be an experience for a lot of people joining startups around fundraising and spending time chasing money is not something that we need to worry about too much right now. We have a very well-seasoned team. Most of the people in the startup are former C-level executives. So we've got a clear direction and experienced team, and are well funded, and we take a science-first approach. So real quick, we're focused on ag, consumer products, and life sciences at the company. Just about any place that you imagine water is used, we could probably have an impact. So one of our biggest challenges is sticking to our strategy, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. We aim to be an ingredient brand, so we're not looking to sell directly to consumers, but we're gonna kind of brand ourselves as an ingredient brand and sell a piece of equipment that helps companies process water. And the last slide, I just added this in for the P&G folks. If anybody's worked in skincare, this is just an example of some of the science that we've generated with the water. We actually tapped into some former P&G alumni to help us formulate some skincare formulas with niacinamide, which is the ingredient in Olay Regenerist, and looked at its penetration into actual human skin samples. And you look on the far right, you can see that we were able to penetrate niacinamide significantly better than kind of the water that P&G uses in their formula today. So we're pretty excited about some of the opportunities that we have, and who knows where the future will take us. So that's part of the excitement of being at a startup. So first, building credibility and trust. If I grew up just south of Flint, so that whole story about the Flint water crisis is very near and dear to my heart, and that you can lose credibility and trust very quickly. And I think this is one that is absolutely critical if you are thinking about joining a startup. Most of us, well, all of us on this call have left P&G, and I would say most of us have heard at some point from a headhunter as we left our roles that your most valuable point in your career is not when you're leaving P&G, it's the company after you left P&G. When you're leaving that company is probably when you've maximized your value. And that's really because of credibility, right? There's a big credibility gap that most of us have when we leave P&G, and a big question in a lot of companies' minds: can this person operate outside of the structured environment of P&G, where they've got all these resources and you've been trained in a certain way, and then you get out of that environment, and some people thrive, and some people, it's a tough transition. And for that reason, you don't really earn the credibility or trust of companies to hire you into senior roles, I would say, until you've proven that you can operate outside of that environment. And the same thing goes for startups. If you're going to find somebody that's going to take a risk on you from a startup, and you haven't been at one before, you have to kind of figure out how you're going to build that credibility. So if you've ever been scuba diving, you know about buddy breathing, and to me, that's kind of one of the most striking examples of trust. You're trusting somebody with your life with that, and I think that's from a startup standpoint, people are trusting you with their investment and the future of their company early on. So you have to build that credibility. I did a lot of networking when I was looking to join after I left Volvo, and decided that startup was what I wanted to do. I did a ton of networking, and I got that feedback directly from a lot of people. I remember talking to the CEO of Oatly, Mike Messersmith, who I had kind of gotten introduced to through a P&G network, and he was very clear that you need to be prepared that you're going to do everything when you come into this role, and you need to be able to demonstrate that you can literally program the we were talking about marketing, but he's like, you need to be able to demonstrate that you can actually get in there and program the programmatic feeds for marketing, and you need to be able to step back and be able to talk about the bigger strategy. And at the time, I didn't have that credibility. I had to build that, and so I did a few things to build it. I got involved in angel investing, so that's one thing that I would highly recommend. If you haven't done that before, I joined an angel investing group, and just for the experience of going through the due diligence and sitting on the other side of the table from people who were pitching their ideas. If you're not familiar with angel investing, it's basically Shark Tank. I mean, you sit in the group and people pitch their idea to you, and you form a due diligence team, typically in these groups, and you go and make a decision on whether you're going to invest. And so I learned a ton. I actually did start angel investing and learned a ton about what a good pitch looks like and what a bad pitch looks like, and what a good idea looks like in terms of a company and, what's important. So that was one step along the way to building some credibility. And the other was some consulting. So I did, did some networking into some venture capital groups and offered up my services from a consulting standpoint. So there were a couple different startups that I helped consult for, and some accelerators. So that's groups of entrepreneurs who are coming in for a short period of time to, kind of get their company off the ground. And I participated in a couple of the accelerator sessions for some startups. And that's really how I made my way into Hydrosome. I mentioned I was advising before I joined, so I got connected to Hydrosome and started advising them as a company, and I did that for 9 months before I joined. Some of that was on their part, but a lot of that was also on my part. And I'll talk about the kind of culture and the importance of that. But we were making sure we were the right fit for each other during that period of time. So that's it. So build credibility and trust, and I'm sure there's millions of other ways that you can think of to do that, but that's my approach and what I did. Follow your passions. So those who know me know I'm very passionate about skiing. Most of the pictures in this presentation are clip art, but this one is actually one that I took from one of my heli ski trips. So very passionate about the ski industry. I coach on the weekends, and my kids are all skiing, and so that's one thing that's guided me since I left college, is find a role, find a purpose, find a company that you're super passionate about, and pursue that. So I went to a small school when I was, my kids are in the middle of college decision time right now, and I know when I went, I had the choice between going to a big school and going to a small school where I could run track and cross country. And I was super passionate about track and cross country and running. And so I made the decision to go to a pretty small unknown school instead of going to the University of Michigan, because I had the opportunity to run track and cross country there. So those kind of decisions about following your passion have always been at the heart of who I am. I tried to get a job at a ski area, or a ski company rather, coming out of college, was a bit unsuccessful in that pursuit, but landed at P&G, and thankfully, was passionate about marketing and passionate about building brands, and that sustained me through my time there. But it's important from a startup standpoint, because you like I said, you're going to be pitching people for money. They need to feel your passion. People can see through somebody who's just going through the motions, and you're, in a startup, and kind of most business these days, you're always on call, right? But in a startup in particular, you're in the early days trying to preserve your capital, and you could be putting in 70-hour weeks. And if you're not passionate about what you're doing, you're not going to be having fun. So follow your passions and make sure that whatever it is that you're looking at is something that you're super passionate about. Culture. So I know a lot of HR folks like to use the iceberg analogy about culture, meaning that a lot of what you see on the surface isn't really, the true culture. You have to understand and kind of get into the midst of a company and understand all the things that are going on below the surface to really understand the company. And a small company often is influenced very highly by its founders. So if you're joining, especially at an early stage, I'd say your founders are the culture. You may be on a team of 3 or 4, I was employee number 3 when I joined. We're up to 7 employees now, but it is very much, we can all sit around the table and have a conversation and make decisions, and we are the culture. If you're joining a little bit of a later stage, you're still early enough in the evolution of the company to be able to help influence and create that culture. So you need to make sure that the culture of the company is aligned with your values. In this case, our mission is really about improving people's lives and improving the world. We think our technology can have a huge impact on not only the effectiveness of things from pharmaceuticals to agriculture, but also help impact the water crisis that we face in the world. So that was very inspiring to me, to be part of a company that is focused and dedicated on making a difference in the world. So you need to know what it is that's important to you, and make sure that culture is a fit. The way that I did it is I spent 5 or 6 months consulting for this company, and most of it on my own dime, to be honest, and traveled and met the people and spent some time in their facilities, and just really wanting to know, can I work with these people, and is their mission just a set of words, or is it something that they live every day? And it truly is something that we live every day. And the other thing is, you at least in our startup, you have to be humble, and you have to be willing to do whatever it takes. So depending on the days, cleaning the bathrooms and vacuuming the carpet before we have a visitor, to pitching CEOs and talking about strategy. So you have to, that's part of our culture at least, and that's part of what you need probably to be willing to do at a startup. And then the last thing I'd say is, you have a great opportunity to influence the culture too. So not everything is set in stone, and you can bring your own set of values and influence the culture too. And that's what I like about being at the startup, is you're creating something new. One of the things I brought to the company is a very strict focus on science. There's a lot of pseudoscience and magic water claims out there, and a lot of potential for us to not be taken seriously. And if we are going to have a successful company, my thought was, we have to be science-led, and that is kind of how we're approaching things. So you do have an opportunity to influence the culture too. Strategy. So I'd say one of the most critical things at a startup is having a sound strategy and sticking to it. I think, and I've heard this from many people who've been in startups, one of the things that often kills a startup is trying to do too many things at once. And so being very clear on what choices you're going to make. And that's where I think some of the P&G experience on putting the no GSM together and thinking about where to play and how to win, all of those things are absolutely critical if you're going to have a successful startup. Like I said, I think a lot of them fail by trying to do too much too soon. So we at Hydrosome, I think, have a very high risk of falling victim to this, because water's everywhere. And you think about the number of things that use water as a carrying vehicle for active ingredients and solutes. We could pretty much go everywhere. And we made a decision early on that we're going to be focused on agriculture first, personal care second, beverages and skincare and things like that, and pharmaceuticals third. And the technology was originally developed for the pharmaceutical industry, so it was a bit of a pivot for us to say, you know what, we're going to put the pharmaceutical focus on hold, because it's such a long road, and we need to generate revenue, and we think that there's quicker and easier ways to generate revenue earlier by focusing on some of these easier categories to get into, less regulated, and that. And so to cement that strategy, I put this visual up because this is the artwork that is on our conference room wall at our headquarters. So we put that strategy together. That was one of the first sessions after I joined that we had in terms of laying out a strategy. And we said, in order for us to just be reminded of this every day, reminded not only of the potential, but reminded of the decision that, if you look from left to right, we're going to go ag first, consumer second, and pharmaceutical third. And that's been kind of memorialized on our wall, and we have stuck to that for the most part. And I'll talk in my next slide about just the opposite of how you need to be able to embrace uncertainty sometimes. So I think it's important to have a strategy and know where you're headed and know where you're going. But at the same time, you need to be willing to make some pivots and to embrace uncertainty. And the two philosophies, I think, can live hand in hand. It's not one or the other. So making sure, that you are always looking for where a good opportunity is and evaluating against your strategy, and having kind of that plan B in the back of your mind is important. You're always going to face situations where your funding is running out and you may need to make a different decision. You might run into situations where test results come back as you didn't expect them, and you need to kind of formulate a new plan. And I don't think this is unique to startups, right? This happens in every company. And I think this is one of the things also that, we bring from the corporate environment, is that ability to step back from, bad results and understand what went right, what went wrong, and kind of reevaluate. And just really always being ready to pivot. So I don't know how many of you follow some of the stories about Airbnb in their beginning, but when they first started, they had a great idea, but we're struggling with funding and we're running out of money. And so they decided to sell cereal boxes with McCain, I think it was Obama and McCain, printed on cereal boxes as part of the election during that period of time, to raise money to continue to fund their Airbnb idea. So it's a great story. I'm sure that you can Google that and read all about it. But I think the point is, here's this huge successful startup that took a bit of a pivot, because they were running out of money and needed to get creative and figure out a way to raise more money. We did the same, when I was at P&G. You could think about white strips as a startup. We were creating a whole new category. And Colgate came out with a product called Simply White that was probably going to destroy the category based on the claims that they were making. And there was not a lot of kind of established precedent in terms of the types of claims you could make for over-the-counter teeth whitening products, and they were making very unsubstantiated claims at the time. So we decided to launch a brand to compete directly with Simply White, and that was Night Effects. And it was one of the only times in my career that I can think of at P&G where the launch was more of a defensive launch than an offensive launch. We made that decision to launch Night Effects, not because we thought that was a huge opportunity or subsegment of the category at the time, but it was more that we knew we needed to defend white strips and the value that white strips represented to the company. And so we scrambled, and I think it was within 120 or 160 days or whatever, came up with Night Effects and got it on the market and successfully defended the white strips franchise. So be ready to pivot. We had a good example on Hydrosome. So I said we're starting with ag and moving into consumer. Out of the blue, not out of the blue, but a bit off strategy, we had a beverage company approach us and is interested in funding some clinical trials, major beverage company, with our product. And, if you look at our strategic plan, we had beverages probably 2 years from now that we were looking to get into that category. But here's a company that's coming with the willingness to write a big check and fund some clinicals. And, it's not that far off in the future. So we said, you know what, this feels like an appropriate pivot that we can handle. We'll jump ahead to beverages and we'll put some resources on funding this clinical, and we'll continue to focus on ag, but we'll keep this opportunity moving. And if the clinical trials are successful, then we'll look at shifting resources and put some additional resources against that. So always having the kind of the plan B in mind and the willingness to pivot, I think, is important. And then the last one is race to revenue, and my boss is his favorite slide when I showed him the presentation, of course. So one of the things that excites me the most about a startup is this kind of aspect that, especially if you're early, you are likely pre-revenue, and you're essentially in a race to generate revenue before you run out of money, and you have to be kind of balancing that budget of what makes sense to spend money on, and how can you get things done for the least amount of money, and where are the biggest differences that money can deliver. And it's probably one of the biggest differences versus a big company, where you can always find more money in a big company if you've got a great idea. You may not be able to do that in a small company, because you may run out of money before you can get on people's calendars to pitch for additional funding. And then there's always that risk. Most people are in a startup because they're in it for the equity, and the potential payoff that represents. And so you don't want to dilute your equity unless you absolutely have to. So there's this, just for me, very exciting aspect of coming to work every day and figuring out how are we going to get done what we need to get done without spending too much money, and how are we going to get to start generating revenue as fast as we can. So that's my story. Build credibility, say follow your passion. You're the culture, or your founders are the culture, and you need to keep that in mind when you're joining. Don't lose sight that strategy is still absolutely important, and you need to stick to a strategy that you create, but don't die on your sword of the strategy, especially if there's some great opportunities that come along. Make sure that you're willing to embrace uncertainty, and always, always, always focus on generating revenue. So hopefully you enjoyed that. We can move to questions. My email's on the screen, so I'll leave this up for a few minutes. And if if we don't get to your question, please email me. I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bob. I don't think if you can see me, I don't know, my computer is going a little bit off here. If people have questions, please write them on the chat. I definitely have several questions. You talk about from the beginning, even like your story coming out of corporate and jumping into startup. And something I wrote down was to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And especially I've seen it a lot, even in my own experience, that we come from sort of a quote unquote safe space, because in a way being in corporate, it's a little bit safer. At least you go every day to do something that at least you have some control over. But then when you move into entrepreneurship, startups, whatever, I mean, it's a completely new space that you don't know what's going to happen on a daily basis. How did you cope with that feeling more comfortable with the uncomfortable and dealing with it?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. To some extent, it's how I'm wired. So I think, and I don't know that I would recommend a startup for somebody that wasn't somewhat wired that way, because you do have to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. I have always had a philosophy that, my personal happiness comes from within. I'm going to get really deep now for a minute, but like, you know, I grew up, parents were teachers, grew up in a trailer park, like, you know, had really nothing from the beginning, and have always been happy with what I have. And so I'm also happy recognizing that if I lost everything, I could still find happiness somewhere, right? And that has allowed me to embrace uncertainty to some degree, because, you know, I've experienced that. I recognize I can be happy without anything. And so if I lose everything, you know, I'll build it back again, you know. And I think if you talk to a lot of entrepreneurs, there's a lot of people who have gone through that. They've gone through bankruptcy, they've lost everything, they've come back, they've built it again, and they're really excited about the opportunity to be able to build something new again. And so, yeah, you have to be willing to lose it, but also recognize that's part of the, for me, that's part of the fun and excitement of being at the startup.
Thank you. We're having several questions come up. Can you compare and contrast the stress between being in a corporate environment and a startup?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I think, and this is depending on the people's experience and the company that you were at, I think a lot of the stress of corporate America comes more from politics and corporate politics than it does from building the business like in a startup. And not to say that both aren't, you know, present in all situations, but what has been most refreshing for me is on a team of 7 people that, you know, I've done the due diligence on the culture, and feel like we have a good cultural fit, that stress of kind of corporate politics isn't there. We're all focused on moving the business forward, versus the big corporation where you're focused on moving the business forward, but you're also focused on understanding how you're going to position yourself and your project or proposal or whatever within the scope of the kind of corporate politics.
Thank you. Brian McCleary says hi. Long time since thermacare and whitening. And he's asking, from your experience as an angel investor and consultant to venture capital, what do you see as the difference between a good pitch and a bad pitch?
Great question. I think the best pitches are solving a problem, and they understand what that problem is right up front. So if you can identify the consumer problem, the corporate, the business problem, if you're a B2B business, what is the problem that your technology can solve that isn't being solved today? It's really identifying that white space. And if you can clearly articulate that and how your product solves it, and then keep the rest short in terms of, building that. It's just like any other concept, benefit, reason to believe, whatever. Give the people the reason to believe that your solution and your company can solve that problem, and do it succinctly. I think you're going to be successful. Most of these pitches, there's having sat through a number of these in the Angel Forum, Shark Tank's pretty accurate in terms of you typically have about 5 or 10 minutes to tell your story. And then you have another 5 or 10 minutes to answer questions. And that's how most of these angel investing roadshows and pitches go. And so you have to be able to tell your story very succinctly, in order to get people hooked.
And continuing on with that line of questioning, what do you think is the most important part in the pitching process to investors between the first meeting and the second meeting, assuming you get to the second meeting?
Yeah, well, the second meeting is usually you've got at least some people interested, and you are then answering their due diligence questions. So I think the most successful ones that I've seen are people who've been good at answering those questions, right? Understanding what the questions are and providing a very clear answer to those questions. And being open, if again, you're building trust at that stage. And if you're a small team, touting some group of investors, they need to trust that you can deliver on what you're promising, and you're demonstrating that by how you answer their questions and how quickly you respond and how thoroughly you respond. So to me, that's, are you answering their questions in the right way, and are you kind of just behaving in a way that's building trust with them?
And then you talk a lot about credibility all throughout. I mean, from the beginning to get into the startup world, and then throughout. Somebody's asking if you can please like comment a little bit more about building that credibility, especially on how did you get startups to even hire you as a consultant, like way in the beginning, and whether they were willing to pay for your services, or was it more like, I'll do things, pro bono, figure it out, and then build credibility from there?
Yeah. Everybody's journey on that one is going to be different. For me, I leverage networking, and the P&G network is a fantastic one. I reached out to a lot of my colleagues who were now in venture capital or private equity, and made my way to a few who were, one in particular who was leading an accelerator, and another in particular who was an angel investor and doing a lot of angel investing on his own, and they were willing to make introductions to these startups for me. I had a few paid opportunities, but I also did a lot of pro bono or free, so I started out at Hydrosome for free. My journey to Hydrosome was actually through the CEO of Hydrosome is a brother of somebody who's in town where I live, and I had been putting my message out there that I was interested in joining a startup, and he said, well, I know somebody that's looking for somebody like you. My brother just is in a startup, and so that's kind of how we got introduced. And like anything, it was a little bit of a dance in the beginning to get to know each other, and I said, yeah, I'll join some of your meetings and join some of your calls, and started getting involved. And all of that in the beginning was free, my own time. Eventually they started paying me for travel and some other things as I was consulting. But I think if you're passionate about it, yeah, you need to be willing to put in some of that time for free, I would say.
And in terms of also investing, not only time, but did you invest like yourself money into the startups? Do you recommend that? Is it more about time? Is it depending?
Yeah, I think it depends. For me, that was part of my strategy to build credibility. So when I joined the angel investing group, I had the full intent that I'm going to invest in things that I find interesting. And I think it does build credibility to say that, yes, you are an investor as well. I invested eventually in the company that I'm at too, because I felt like that was important to be able to say I have enough confidence in the direction we're going that I put my own money behind it. Didn't have to, and the founders were very clear, like, we don't expect you to invest and don't need to, but to me that was important. And it's been fun. And angel investing, you can join any kind of investing group where you can put a few $1,000s in, or you can put $100,000 in or more. It's up to kind of what your risk tolerance is. But for me, it's more about the experience and the connections that you make.
Thank you. And in terms of strategy, I mean, you talk about that as being very important no matter what. Any recommendations on how to pivot if you think your strategy isn't spot on at the first time, which I imagine happens very frequently?
Yeah. I mean, we gave the example of our pivot, which was bringing beverage in a little bit sooner than we thought. And that was because of an opportunity that we had. So we had an opportunity to accelerate our earnings, if you will, because of that opportunity. Sometimes you're going to pivot because the opposite of that, like you get a test that comes back that, doesn't work. We're a technology company, and a lot of technology companies are startups that, whatever their beta is, fails, and then you need to kind of step back and think about what other opportunities you could have for your technology. So I think part of that strategy development, you're always assessing the landscape. If you're doing a really good job of developing strategy, you're going to assess the landscape in the beginning, and then you're going to come up with a where to play, how to win. And in that assessing the landscape, you're going to have probably a list of opportunities that you see where your technology could apply. And if something happens that crosses the first or one or two off the list, you've always got a plan B or plan C to go to. So hopefully that answered the question.
Great. Well, we're almost out of time. I'm going to put two questions into one. And if we still have a couple more questions, but Bob, you gave us your email. So I invite everybody, if you still want to connect after the last question, please feel free to email Bob. You talked about skills, and, we come with a lot of great skills, most of us out of P&G. What skills did you need to develop? That, things that you weren't taught in the corporate environment.
That's really good. I talked about cleaning bathrooms and sweeping the floor and all of that. I came out of a marketing background. I'm more of a general manager now, to kind of doing everything. So I really had to hone, I'd say, my finance skills in particular. That's more personal to me. And we had to put a website together, and I was literally learning how to kind of do the details of building a website on my own. So that's what I like about a startup, really, is that I'm one who I think you always should be learning. And I think that's how you keep yourself young, and I think keep your brain active. And so to me, that's a skill in itself, is a thirst for knowledge and a thirst for learning and a curiosity. We recruit based on that criteria, I would say. Curiosity. That is one of the most important, for me, traits from a startup, is that you bring people in who are curious and want to learn, because you're always in a learning mode in a startup, and absorbing that knowledge and then figuring out how you're going to apply that to your plan.
Thank you, Bob. This was wonderful. Any final thoughts, recommendations, invitations to our audience?
No, I mean, obviously visit our website. I'd love to hear from you. And I think the foundational thing for me is that follow your passion. Know what you're passionate about. Maybe it's not a startup. Maybe it's corporate America. Maybe it's one of these mid-sized companies or something like that. But really spend the time to understand what it is that you're passionate about if you're thinking about making a career change, and put your heart and soul into that.
Thank you so much. Let me invite people to get involved. Sign up for updates at pgalums.com, support our foundation at pgalumnifoundation.org, partner with us at sponsorpgalums.com, and volunteer, start a chapter or join a chapter. Like I shared, we have 43 chapters around the world. If you have any questions on where you can find a chapter, send us an email. You can also get access to this recording of the webinar and to all past recordings. Bob already mentioned a couple that we've had in the past that have been wonderful. We will have them available both at our website at pgalums.com and also in our YouTube page. This one should come up in a couple of weeks' time. And send us an email just with any thoughts, any recommendations on topics that you'd like to hear about for future webinars. And I invite you to join us next month with Alex von Schermeister, who will be talking to us about digital marketing transformation and if that's going to produce CMOs of the future. Bob, thank you again so much for being with us today. And I hope that everybody has a wonderful rest of your day wherever in the world you are. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.